Stanley Gordon. I'm the owner of the property on which the Ingalls Dugout Site is located. I was raised here as a child and have come back in the last 25 years to take over the operation of it for the benefit of the community. And so this is essentially our retirement project. Well, we started out here after being in semi-retirement in the early 90s, and then fully retired in 96, and refurbished the buildings and planted prairie grasses and built this trusty bridge and a whole host of things to make it a little more comfortable and safe for visitors. The flood of 18 was probably our biggest challenge that we've ever had out here. You'll be shown pictures of the extent of the damage and so on that was done, but this bridge that we're standing on, there was debris on the top railing here. That was an unheard of height of water in our experience. And it didn't take out the bridge, so we're grateful for that. This was one of my pet projects all along. I said I probably did more engineering on the dugout site than I did in the last 20 years on my various jobs in the professional world. In a normal year, we get between 2,000 and 2,500 cars. We don't have any way of counting the number of individuals in those cars. We keep it simple. I have a magnetic loop in the driveway which counts the cars coming and going, and so we have a pretty good idea of our car traffic. The people are a particularly high-class group in our opinion. We've had individuals that have been maybe a dollar short, and we'll get a letter in the mail with $1. I think the record was we got a letter in the mail with a quarter in it once. They're very respectful. We very seldom, if ever, have any trash to pick up, and they're just interesting folks. They're interested in how Laura's home, childhood home, may have looked in the 1870s. Probably the most interesting that I recall. There was a lady and her daughter from Japan, and they were a little confused as to what they should do. They pulled up into our yard, and we happened to be working out in the yard and talked to them a little bit, and found out that they were here to help the daughter with her high school paper. And so they flew from Japan to Minnesota, and they had two objectives. They were going to go to Mall of America, and they were going to go to Walnut Grove. And then they were flying back to Japan. So we felt honored to be included with the Mall of America. Well, she would have gone straight south from the dugout and could have walked all the way to Walnut Grove without crossing any creeks or any bodies of water. That's when they lived in the dugout. However, as near as I can tell, and I haven't done the amount of research that I know a lot of Laura fans have done, but it is likely that their house was built across the creek, and there to get to Walnut Grove, they would have had to cross on a footbridge. It might have been a log of some kind. There's some discussion in her book about this log crossing and that she almost drowned in the creek from this log. So I think after they built their frame house on the opposite side, which would be on that side of the creek, they would have had to cross either by fording the creek with their horse and wagon, and at times it's certainly shallow enough to do that. Um, they would have had to have some way of crossing on, probably a log that they rounded up someplace. It's very unlikely that there were hardly any trees here other than the possibility of trees that would escape the periodic prairie fires on the downwind side of water. So if a northwest wind was the predominant direction, the trees on the southeast side would probably survive, and that would be probably the only timber that would be available. Everything else would be periodically cleaned out by prairie fires. Uh, Several years ago, there was a very large willow tree uh, near the dugout, and it started to drop branches, which is not something you want near the dugout. And so we cut it down and counted the rings and came up with a number like 75. And so I'm guessing that that was one of the largest trees that we were aware of, and post-dated the Ingalls residence here. Yeah, uh, people will tend to follow one of the paths from the parking lot over to a overlook, if you want, that frames the dugout site. And so that's a popular spot. And then, of course, they're already here. And so they'll see, okay, there's the bridge. We can get across the creek and we can get up close to the dugout site. And so that's very, very popular. They can get an idea, some frame of reference as to the size and the location of the dugout relative to the water and the surrounding terrain. And then they come back across the bridge and they'll follow the path, and they'll generally find themselves as they walk along the creek near what we think was the big rock. And that has a sign posted by it. Uh, when the water is low, it's easy to find, but sometimes the water, or lots of times the water isn't that low. Our land tenant for many, many years had worked for a construction company, and uh, we had decided to excavate the rock and see if you could bring it up a little bit so people could enjoy it more. And after they dug down the full reach of a track hole, they still weren't to the bottom of it. And so we estimate that the thing was about 8 feet by 10 feet by at least 10 feet in dimensions. And a few calculations say the thing, probably being granite, weighed 75 tons and wasn't going anywhere. So they just put the dirt back where they found it and said, well, it's going to have to stay that way. uh, The only thing that we notice is, and we really appreciate this, is that we have an honorary collection box where people deposit their money per car. And during the year, we'll get several very nice messages saying, thank you so much for making this available to us. And we get several of those each year. Um, but as far as messages, other places we haven't looked and haven't found, I guess. Okay, in 1998-99, the DNR had a program where they were encouraging the planting of prairie flowers, particularly along roadsides. And they approached us about maybe planting a patch or two here for, just to see if we could get something to go. And so we did that. And it was something that was on our list of things to do. My wife, Hazelle, had always been interested in getting some prairie grasses established. And so that was an opportune time to do that. We had to kill off all the existing vegetation and plant prairie mixes from known suppliers of prairie grasses and try and get it started. And getting it started is a little difficult. It requires mowing it about 3 times each year for 3 years to discourage things that aren't prairie grasses. And eventually it gets enough of a foothold so that it can survive on its own. And as I often tell people, getting a prairie established is easy if you treat it like a garden. And then in 2002, we got interested in the CREP program, which combines conservation reserves and permanent easements with prairie grass establishments. So with that, we planted about another 25 acres in land that had formerly been farmed. And, this is farmland that is not necessarily the best, might be a little more prone to erosion, a little more difficult to farm. So we planted about 25 acres of prairie grasses in the CREP program. And that was a big jump forward because people could come out here during much of the season and get more of a flavor as to what it might have looked like. One of the interesting things about prairies like this, they're different every year. One year you have just more yellow flowers, and another year you have something else. And but over time, why it has settled down, and we think the visitor gets a lot of enjoyment out of that. To maintain that, we would burn it every 5 years, and that was always kind of exciting. We would my wife and I, we would very carefully plan out plots that we would cut fire strips around the fall before, and then we'd light them off. And it didn't take long to get 25 acres burned in this little hollow over here, which you may not be able to see. We'd get the fire NATO. So it was exciting, and fortunately we never had anything get away from us. But now we're beyond that, and it will be maintained by haying 1/3 of it each year. That keeps the small trees under control and noxious weeds and things like that, in theory. So now it's going to provide cattle feed as well as enjoyment. Our intent at this point is to ensure that future generations will have access to this site. With the conservation reserve, it's virtually impossible to build anything or make any excavations and do a dummy dugout or anything like that. It's going to stay just the way it is by the way the conservation reserve is set up. And it's our intent to identify the areas of the property that encompass the conservation reserve and the dugout and the current building site, and donate that to some viable local nonprofit so that it can be maintained without being in competition with the local nonprofits. That's our intent now, but time will change. It could change. And we intend to do this to make it available for visitors as long as we're willing and able to do it. And Lord only knows how many years that is, but so far, so good.